This is the first time I did tile, but I discovered it's actually not that hard, and I'm gonna show you how to do it in the next 6 minutes. The tools that you're gonna need to do this are a tile saw, a trowel, a grout float, a sponge, a 5-gallon bucket, and a utility knife. And for materials, you'll need tile, thinset, and grout. Don't worry about writing that down. I'll have links to all the tools and materials in the description. Before we can start laying our tile down, we need to prep the ground. Since my bathroom is in my basement, I'm laying my tile directly onto concrete. I made a huge mistake when painting this bathroom by not masking the floors. Now I have a thick layer of overspray that I need to get rid of before I can tile. I hoped I could scrape it off because that would be the quickest and easiest way, but that just wasn't working. So I had to use my angle grinder to grind it off. It took me about 2 hours and I only ground about 90% of the paint, but now I feel much more confident that my thinset is gonna adhere to the ground. It's likely that you're not tiling directly onto concrete, in which case you may need an underlayment. Regardless, everything I'm gonna show you is the same whether you have an underlayment or not. Before we get started tiling, I recommend you remove any doors in the room. It's just gonna make the install a lot easier. All right, now we're ready to start laying down some tile. Now this is where the tile saw is really gonna come in handy. We're gonna use the tile saw to give us a perfectly straight edge. A tip I picked up was to use a piece of scrap. I'm using some vinyl plank here, and you can get really close to the blade without actually getting your fingers right up next to it. And it allows you to put down even pressure and to get a really smooth cut. And this straight edge is important because we need the tile to sit right up against the wall. Now the first room I did was this little laundry closet, and I cut all of the pieces before I started laying any down with thinset. But once I got the hang of it, I honestly wasn't too concerned about it, and I would just cut them as I went. To apply the thinset, I would just throw it down in globs, and then I would go back over it with the trowel and smooth it out. As you're applying thinset, make sure that you have these two things in mind. Number one, that you have the proper amount, and number two, that it's consistently spread. If not, it's a total nightmare when it comes to these small hexagonal tiles because there are tons of cracks for the thinset to squeeze out of. And that means tons of cracks that you have to clean out later. The trowel you use will be determined by the tile that you're using. For this hexagonal tile, I'm using a 1/4 inch trowel and I'm holding it at about a 30 or 45 degree angle as I'm troweling. And the trowel is really how you're able to measure and get a consistent amount of thinset down. Another trick I picked up for these small format tiles is to use the grout float actually to press it down into the thinset. Applying even pressure is really important, so that grout float allows you to do that. Now with larger tiles, you're going to want to use some spacers to ensure that your gaps are all even, but with these smaller hexagon tiles, there's just too many gaps that it really didn't make too much sense for me to use those, so I'm just eyeballing it. I figure that at the end of the day, I'm using a white grout, so any inconsistencies are really going to be hidden by the grout. You'll have to get a little creative when you're tiling next to the shower or around things like the toilet flange. And I had so many pieces of hexagons already cut off that I just used those. I hardly had to go cut a custom piece to fit because I had so many scraps. And so I just kept on tiling until I tiled myself out of the room. And once you're done laying the tile, make sure nobody steps on it for 24 hours. Now is where your utility knife comes into play, as we're going to use it to scrape out the excess thinset that's in the gaps. And also vacuum all of the excess bits so that we have a clean slate before we grout. Adding the grout is fairly straightforward, but it is a little tedious. You really want to make sure you're coming at the grout from every direction you can. We want to make sure we force out all of the air and replace it with grout. So really give it some elbow grease and make sure you get it in there as best you can. After adding the grout, there's typically a lot of residue on top of the tile, so this is where that sponge comes into play. So here I have the 5-gallon bucket filled up about halfway with water, and I'm using it to rinse the sponge while I'm wiping off the excess grout. And you don't want to forget that step, and you need to do it fairly soon after you grout because it does dry pretty fast. Do your best to get as much of this haze off as you can now, because if not, it's going to be much harder the next day. And just like before when we were laying the tile, you want to keep in mind where you start and where you finish.
That's why I started in the closet and I'm finishing towards the door, because I'm working my way out of the room. And that's it. It's fairly simple. Just follow these steps and you'll come out with a really good product.
No one mentions this, but definitely use a grout sealer as well. You'll add that the day after you finish the grout, and it will make your tile way easier to clean, and the grout is not going to get discolored like it would otherwise. In total, I spent $400 to tile my 120 square foot bathroom. If I were to hire a contractor, this would have cost me about $2,000 to $3,000, likely on the higher end of that because of the small hexagon tiles. This is the 6th video in my basement renovation series. If you want to see how I turned this unfinished space into this basement apartment, then tap the red subscribe button. It's completely free for you. That just means that the next time I post a video, it's going to show up for you in your feed. And I post videos every hump day, give or take a few days. Here's the complete video on how I turned my unfinished basement into an apartment.